Drain the big bog? Well, that's impossible, but they tried. Today's program was recorded at the Big Bog Recreation Area in Waskish, Minnesota.
Welcome to Big Bog State Recreation Area here in Waskish, Minnesota. Today's presentation is going to be by Diane Mostedberg from Kelliher, Minnesota, and the title of it is Ditching, the Bog That Couldn't Be Tamed.
Yeah, just a bunch of bolts together.
Oh, that whole ditcher?
You know how much is left? They dug a little stub off the end of it.
Also attending the program with local area residents was the 6th grade school out of Kelliher, accompanied by Christy Pink. Join us as we go back in time to the early 1900s to see photographs of huge dredges that dug miles of ditches across the Big Bog. Hear Diane Mosted talk about the men and women that worked in this vast wilderness under dreadful conditions in a futile attempt to build roads and make the land suitable for farming. Close-up and detailed photos used in this presentation is from Diane Mosted's PowerPoint program.
Yes, looks like everybody's here. What's that? Oh, did you see a couple more?
Is the amplifier turned on?
Not yet.
Oh.
I don't need one.
Well, they say that.
Looks like we're got a couple more coming in, but we can probably get started. Welcome to Big Bog State Recreation Area, and thank you all for coming on kind of a chilly day, but the sun is out, so it makes it beautiful. We are happy to have with us today Diane Mosted from Kelliher, from the Kelliher area. She is also is a representative of the North Beltrami County Heritage Center, kind of a mouthful. That is the museum that's in Kelliher. Outside the museum, you'll see all of the wonderful sculptures that we've made from junk art. Yeah, it's junk art basically, but if you haven't been there, you'll have to stop in. And inside the museum, of course, they're always swapping out exhibits and have some regulars on display as well.
And we also put up the exhibit in the new school, in those 2 community exhibits. So there's one up there now, and we'll be putting up another one this Thursday. So we'll wait and see what it is.
Yeah, okay. Well, we're happy to have Diane here. And actually, it sounded like you were, I guess you weren't. It sounded like you were.
Well, now we're wired.
Okay. Everybody here good in the back even? Okay.
I was raised in this area, out in the Somme area, and on the Battle River. And there are lots of little pots of peat out there. And so I was kind of raised in an area, I was very aware of the peat bogs and how kind of interesting they were. So I've always been kind of fascinated with bogs. And then when the opportunity for this one came along, and to have this massive resource right in our backyard was really amazing to me, because there's nothing else like it left in the world. Though peat has, there are places where peat is still in the world, most of it has been mined out, and now this amazing resource is still available to us here. So the reason I got into this little project was because I was taking a Master Naturalist course, and we had to do a project, like 6th graders, right? You do projects. So I thought, geez, what do I want to know more about? And it was really to know more about, why did they ever try to ditch the bog? I mean, what didn't they know? That they would spend all that time and all those resources and all that money to put ditches in the bog, which they really did not understand what it was. And so that's what drew me to this, and that's what I got started in. So a lot of the photos on here, these are SAT photos from the University of Minnesota under NASA. So we've been granted to use some of these. And I also the majority of my research came out of this wonderful resource. It's a very technical book, but it's a wonderful one, The Patterned Peatlands of Minnesota. And this book was written in response to the first people that flew over this area and looked down and thought, what is that? And they had discovered a brand new landform down there. So this is kind of what this is going to be about. And later on, I have some dry agricultural peat and some wet agricultural peat. I'll put it on those tables out there if you want to stick your hand in there and see what it feels like when it's dry. So how did they even originate? We know that the glaciers were here about 10,000 years ago. And after the retreat of the glaciers, of course, they left all this water, and then they retreated and they dropped stuff and they picked stuff up and they retreated back. And as they retreated, Lake Agassiz was formed from the drainage. And it left a plain covered with water. And in the winter, of course, it was ice. And I don't know if you know this, but as you were coming from Kelliher is the beachfront of Lake Agassiz. Red Lake is a remnant of the massively huge Lake Agassiz. And it still goes all the way, it was all the way up into Canada. So we were part of a very huge lake to begin with. Now today, Minnesota still has 6,000 acres of peatland. It's more than any other state in the lower 48. And you can see where the peatlands are up here. You also recognize this. Everybody know what that is? Red Lake. Yeah. So you can kind of get an idea of where the peatlands are, the Red Lake peatlands. Now we call it the Big Bog. And the peatlands themselves, the Red Lake peatlands, cover over about 83,000 acres. Now, over thousands of years, these landforms were created. It was really kind of flat, so it wasn't draining anywhere. The water in the bog actually moves north of Ludlow Island, not very fast because it's so level and flat there. But that's where the water flows north. Actually, south of Ludlow Island, that's where the water runs south to Red Lake. And that actually filters that water and cleans that water that goes into Red Lake. So the peat serves a really good function for cleaning that water out and filtering it out. And this is just, again, there's Upper Red Lake down there, so you can see these are different symbols. There's the fen, are these little parts right here. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. The white area is actually bog area. And you can, the striped area is loamy lake. And then the dark black area, that is a clay lake bed. So we have a whole variety of stuff under us. There were underground rivers of fresh water created, and those are called fens. And the fens are actually this part right here. So there is fresh water under here. Can you imagine this huge piece of peatland and how much water is stored in there? Either underneath or in the peat itself. And then the other parts of the peatland, which were like they are only fed by rain and snow, and they turn very acidic as plants are rotted. And I don't know if you've done any experiments in chemistry or anything like that. And then the water stagnated, and then that area then was covered by sphagnum moss, and these are called bogs. This is agricultural peat, which is really from sphagnum moss. So it would be green, and have you guys been on the bog walk? Mm-hmm. So you kind of know what the peat looks like up there. So that is peat that would be dried, sphagnum moss actually. Because not all peat is the same. This is, again, an aerial photograph. So these simple water currents that are heading north created these, they're called ovoid islands, okay? They look like a teardrop. And what do you think is on that island?
Trees.
Trees. Who said trees? Yep, those are trees on there. So it's a high enough piece of land that it could support trees. Remember when you were out on the bog walk? Remember how small the trees were?
Yeah.
Because some of those are trying to grow in the peat. They can't send their roots down because that water is acid. It would kill the root. So they have to grow right on top of the peat, and they have to depend on whatever comes down in the form of rain or other kinds of nutrients. So that's why they're so small, and they get to be very, very old. Now, homesteading happened relatively early in Minnesota, but northern part of Minnesota that we saw was kind of wet and bog covered. So it did not happen in the northern part of the state. It wasn't accessible. But in 1858, anybody know, I put that in red. Do you know what's significant about that date? You might not have gotten that far yet. David?
Minnesota became a state.
Minnesota became a state. And so then Minnesota as a state could pass drainage laws that led to the draining of the Red Lake peatlands, or the attempt. But these laws could not be used in the Red Lake peatlands until the land was ceded to the United States along with other Ojibwe lands in 1889. The word Chippewa was used in the reference that I used, so that's why I used it there. But I think we more normally are saying Ojibwe. These are some of the first shallow ditches that were cut. And then the U.S., here you've got the United States government involved in this, you've got Minnesota government involved in this, and then you've got just this local area up here that's involved with this. So anytime anything happens, you have to look at federal law, you have to look at state law, and then you have to look at what's happening locally within that context. So the U.S. Geological Survey stated that this land, this swampy, boggy land, could be reclaimed, and it could be turned into good farming land that could then be taxed, and there would be revenue for the state or the federal or whoever. And it could support a very large population. Now, if you think of the Red Lake peatlands north of Red Lake, do you think that turned out to be true? Are there lots and lots of people living up north of this area between here and Baudette? Anybody been up there before? Traveled that road? Maybe you guys haven't been there. But there really are not so many people living there because it's still not a very hospitable place to actually have a farm. So the Volstead Act then was a federal law that was signed into law in 1908, and it allowed the state to apply drainage laws to the land held in trust for the Ojibwe Indians by the federal government. That's what that law allowed the land to be ditched. And so they said, given the conditions of the bog, which they really didn't understand at the time, it will be very slow progress. If we drained it all, every quarter section, okay, how much is a quarter section? Who knows?
1/4.
It's 1/4, and you know what number that is? How many acres? Do you know how many acres?
25 acres.
A little bit more. Come on, somebody.
160.
Is 160 a quarter? Or is that a whole?
160.
160. Okay. So they thought people would be farming that all the way from here up to Canada. And we know that's not true. So what happened? So then ditching costs were going to be assessed to the farmers that use the ditches. They would pay taxes on them. And then they would pay a minimum of $1.25 an acre, and then that money would be used to compensate the tribes. That money would go back for the use of that land. So floating dredges were used in the Red Lake peatlands because the depth of the peat and the very wet conditions that were there. Much of the peat was more than 10 feet deep. It could range between 1 and 15 feet. It's an interesting photograph. I didn't realize there were that many women that worked on the dredges, but you see in this photograph there's a woman with a child. And in the background you see some of the housing that they lived in, which were basically little trailers. And it had to be pretty boggy and buggy out there.
Yeah, they lived right there. Huh?
Yes, they did. I've got some other pictures too. Now the winter before this construction was going to happen, they had to dig these little narrow ditches, and they would survey it so you'd see this nice straight line of ditch. And in the winter, when it froze solid, then they could pull in wood, and the wood was used then to burn in the steam dredges to power it. But they had to do all that the winter before, because can you drive on the bog when it's summertime? No. And then later on, they used oil burning dredges. So then they had to do the same thing. They had to pull all these containers out there and put them on the edge of the bog, and that made possible for the dredging the following year. The dredging means to dig up all the peat out of there and make a ditch. The floating dredge had a boom, that's the big part on the front, and a big shovel that could scoop up from 1/2 to 3/4 of a cubic yard of peat, which then it deposited on the bank. Now, can you imagine, they're pulling all this dirt out and they're piling up all along. What do you think became of that dirt that was all piled up? Can you think of any use for that?
Road.
Roads. When they put it all together on top, next to the ditches, then you have the beginning of a road. Okay. So they were really doing two things at once. And a dredge might be able to dig 200 to 500 feet a day. Doug, do you know how long this building is? It's over 100 feet. So maybe twice the length of this building to 5 times the length of this building is how far they could go in a day. Doesn't seem very far, but that's the equipment they had to use. Now, I love this one. One day, digging on Judicial Ditch number 30, 2 miles west of Hillman Lake, Art Winecook wrote in his daily report, "High winds, rough seas, unable to dig." Can you imagine what peat is like when it's just a bunch of wet ground? So when the wind comes up, it just starts going like this, and they couldn't dig there any longer. There was a cook shack and a bunkhouse, and in the very wet areas, they were pulled right behind the dredge. And there was also a blacksmith forge and electric lights that were powered by a generator for working at night. So they must have had to continue working at night. All in all, there was about 2.8 million spent in Beltrami and Koochiching counties for the drainage of 1.8 million acres. And they created about 2,000 miles of ditches and roads, and it cost about $1,650 a mile. That seems really cheap now, because I don't know what the rate is for developing a road now for a mile. I mean, we're talking millions probably.
And that was when Beltrami County went all the way to Vedette.
Yes, yes. And do you know what this is right here?
A river?
I didn't hear.
A river?
It's not a river, it's pretty straight.
A ditch.
It was after the ditch. Highway 72, that's Highway 72, going right up to the ditch. And you can't see on the bottom here because it runs out, but there was a tiny blue part down here, and that's the upper part of Upper Red Lake.
There's Ludlow Island there too. Quite
Yes.
Ludlow Island.
Yes. Ludlow Island is right here. When you went up there for your field trip in the spring, that's Ludlow Island. So you've been there. Now, there was a gentleman from Bemidji. He was a lawyer, and his name was A.A. Andrews, and he charged potential buyers of land $25 for a boat ride across Red Lake to view some of the property they might want to buy. And he would only show them kind of the highest property to show them the best property. And this happened repeatedly wherever they had bog land and they were trying to sell it. Okay, so there's always a little bit of a schemer in a lot of these stories about settlement. So whatever history you're reading, you're going to find that over and over. Some people were not very, very scrupulous. you know, so. And this is actually from Bud Petrosky's book, On the Trail. And if you don't have this in your library, you should get it, because it has some wonderful stories about people who lived up here in the early days, going out hunting, setting trap lines, and how difficult life was up here, but the stories are really interesting. How many have read this book already? I figured, yeah. He's got some good pictures in here as well, so it's a good resource for this, around this area. But later on, what happened is the beavers came in and they clogged up, and of course the peat is very soft and very kind of whimsical, and it just kind of flowed back into some of the ditches with other dirt. And so it flooded all the ditch properties. It didn't last very long. Now this is Otto Lenhart's, am I correct? Don gave these to me. And this is related to David, of course, and Don. He boasted that he had running water in the house 2 times a year, up to 6 inches running across his floors. Because they're sitting right on the edge of Tamarack River on one of the ditches, and of course in the spring it just wasn't sufficient, and there really was not anywhere to drain to. And so that water would come in, and that happened to many of the settlers that lived up in that area. Then they eventually had, after the frequent flooding, moved or left the country totally, or moved to drier land, which is what the Lenharts did. And is that the place you're living on right now, David?
No,
That's not the second place they lived on?
no, that was halfway between me and Gary's.
Okay, okay. So, some people stuck it out and tried to make a living of it. I know I've read in lots of cases when the women came here, it was so difficult, and they didn't have anyone to visit with because you're way out in the woods somewhere, you know? And it's not, you don't have cars. And if the men are working, they're working out in the woods, so you have to take care of everything at home. And I know some of the women said, well, we wished we could go back to where we had been. But by the time they got here and invested in what little money they had in building, they couldn't really afford to go back anywhere again. So sometimes people ended up in places just because they couldn't afford to go other places. Now the ditch tax, that's what people were supposed to pay if they had a ditch by their house. That became delinquent nearly 79%. And so people just had moved out, so there were no ditches left to be taxed, there were no places left to be taxed. So what happened, the ditches didn't drain the peatlands for agricultural uses, and the high cost actually almost made 3 counties in northern Minnesota bankrupt. That means they almost went out of business. And that was, you know the county next to us? Couln't County is to our east, and do you know who's to the north of us? What county? Lake of the Woods, thank you. I thought you were trying to say that. And Lake of the Woods actually was a part of Beltrami County. But because of all the ditching and all the costs, they wanted to separate out. They didn't want to have to pay for a lot of those ditching costs because they came back then to those counties to pay for them. But in the end, the state then did take over the debt. And now we have what are called, they're government-owned lands now. So that nobody really owns a lot of that territory. Red Lake Band has some spots, you know, up there. But it's hard to get in there. It's not very accessible. And of course, I put the year 1929 in red. Anybody know what might be significant about that?
Stock market crash.
Stock market crashed. Mm-hmm. So it was very difficult economic times all across this country because people lost fortunes and, you know, people lost their land, their houses, everything they owned. That's why that's kind of a significant number. And it also happened up in this area, but maybe for a little different reason. Ernie Blanchard, he was a forester that used to work here. He worked on one of those barges when he was 13 years old. How old are you guys? 11, 12. He was just a year older than you. And I've heard of more than one 13-year-old that worked on the barge. You know, so it must have been hard work, a lot of shoveling, and of course you guys have lots of muscles when you're that age, but doesn't it seem unusual that you would be out there away from your families working out in the middle of the bog? Seems kind of unusual. And Ernie said, I loved it, he says, there was ditch all through this country, some of it did a good, and a lot of it, just water over the dam. And he thought it was better just to leave it the way it is. Now, you can see this down here? You know what that is?
Upper Red Lake.
That is Upper Red Lake. Very good. Very good. And these are what you would see if you were up in the air or in a satellite. This is a satellite view again. And do you see all of these lines?
Yes.
You know what those are?
Ditches.
Ditches. Ditches. They're ditches. They were ditches that were dug between early 1900s and 1919. What year is it now? 2015. They're still there. So when you mess with the bog, you leave your mark. Okay? Things do not grow back fast in the bog.
Oh, yeah.
Remember, it took thousands of years to create it, but if you make a big dent in it, it'll probably take another thousands of years to change it back. So. Now, Red Lake peatlands were first seen as a unique landform when Navy planes flew practice bombing missions over the Big Bog during the 40s, 50s. And so this one, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Doug, it's a Gremlin TBM, and they were called Avengers. And they were used during World War II. But they had to practice somewhere. And guess where there's a big open space where nobody lives? North of Red Lake, the bog. Nobody lived up there because you couldn't get there. And when they looked down and they saw this and they said, what is that? And they contacted the University of Minnesota. And over many, many years and lots of research, they actually created this book. It's very scientific because that's what they do, but it also has some very good stories in there and a lot of research. So the University of Minnesota then finally figured out this was not what they thought it was when they first tried to ditch it. It's hard to ditch 10-foot deep soup because it just kind of flows back in again. And I remember them saying the peat would float up to the surface and go right back into the ditch, you know, in some places. I believe, can you tell me, this is on the boardwalk, Doug, is this ditch 13?
No, I'm not sure what number it is.
Yeah. It's one of the ditches, and you can see it. That's what's grown up from the ditch. This is 100 years later than when these ditches were made.
That's looking east towards Highway 72.
It is looking east. And we had,
Highway 72 is right on the other side of that, those trees you see at the end there.
nice dark contrast with the sky.
Beautiful.
But it's interesting to see after 100 years, what you do to a bog remains. Now there's a Berger Peat Moss company of Quebec, and they propose to strip mine an area of the bog, which is about 25 miles northeast of here. This is, and it's in the middle of that SNA means scientific and natural area. And they plan to to harvest all the peat in that area for agricultural purposes. This is their peat. Burger peat moss provides 97% of the agricultural peat in Minnesota. And now they're looking for another place to harvest it. So it'll be a very interesting experiment to see how that goes. They've already clear cut a perimeter all the way around. They'll harvest all the trees off there, shear it down, and in the winter, of course, when they can actually drive on there. And that'll be between here and Big Falls, about halfway in between. So it will be interesting to see. They'll utilize about 800 acres up there. I'm not sure how much they'll harvest, but they'll utilize 800 acres just for the processing and the moving it and storing it and all of that kind of thing.
I've heard the actual area that they're gonna mine is 320 acres.
Yeah, it could be. Just the usage is going to end up to be about 800. Yeah. So, and I'm not sure if they're on hold now or if they're on go or where they're at. It kind of stops and goes at different times. So, but that is another use for the bog. But we also have to remember that they do claim that they can restore it in 20 years. What do you think? I don't think so. If we see in the picture of Ditch 13 after 100 years, and I know I've seen their presentation on the process they use, but sphagnum moss does not grow that fast. I'm sorry. So, but it's an interesting possible use for that space. So we'll kind of keep track of that and see what's happening with it. But for young people, it's good for you to pay attention to these things that are happening in your backyards, because you are the future. Yes?
They'll have moss growing on it again almost right away, but it'll be at a lower level than
Right.
the rest of the area around.
Right. So it'll be interesting to watch. Mona? Yes?
Can you use like fertilizer or something to make it grow faster?
The sphagnum moss? I'm not so sure that it works that way. Yes?
What do people use peat for?
It's used for agriculture if you are raising a garden and you want to create a moisture holder in your garden, you would mix it with peat. Or if you're growing seeds in your house or plants in your house, you would use this in your house. But you can do the same thing with, when you throw out the garbage with your, not including meat, but your plant garbage, you can make your own kind of compost. So, it depends on how big a need you have. Because everything balances out in the end, doesn't it? You have to decide how you want to develop and process things, and then how much you want to keep the same way so that you don't lose what you have. And this is, of course, the Big Boardwalk was completed in 2005. And I know those people. That's why. They were hamming it up. Today, visitors view the Big Bog up close alongside the boardwalk, which goes a mile out. And you get to see a whole variety of things. You get to see at the beginning when you start with more mineral soil, so the trees are way bigger, and then you get down a little bit and things start to change all the way along that boardwalk. So it's a really fascinating thing. Yes?
What's the best season to go on the boardwalk?
Spring, summer, when are the lady slippers, when are the pitcher plants in bloom?
Best time to come is probably late May, early June.
Late May, early June.
There's always something different this season.
There is. There's something different blooming all the time. So, and these are small things. You think in micro, because the things in the bog, remember, they don't have a lot of resources to grow on because the soil, the water is too acidic. So they have to grow on whatever comes down from above. And so when the peat rots, that probably makes some compost for them. But the plants are not very big, the trees are not very big, everything is like a miniature. It's really an interesting place. So, what is the future for this vast resource? Those are pitcher plants. It has, with its unique flora and fauna, that's plants and animals, it has some things there that don't exist anywhere else. And this is the, Don, tell me, the wild begonia, I think?
Where's Doug?
Is that the rose begonia?
No, it's hard to say, it's went to seed right there, but maybe
Coming or going?
bog laurel or
Okay.
Bog rosemary.
Is it bog rosemary? I think that looks like it's a place unlike any other. This is cotton grass, by the way. And it has plants in there that you probably won't find in any other location because some plants just only grow in certain places. Now the Red Lake Band is opposed to the mining of the peat because they're worried about what effect it has because the water right now actually cleans the water, the bog cleans the water that enters Red Lake. So you have a fresh, you have a fresh supply of water coming in from the bog. So, and that's what comes south of Ludlow Island. So, and there are a lot of medicinal plants and things like that that, people would really like to see saved that are very unique. So, so it's a place like any other, and its future is kind of up to us. And that's the end, that's the boardwalk when you get out to where the trees are very small, so it probably has a lot of peat and they only grow so big there. Do you have any questions?
How soon is that dredging going to take place of the peatland?
The harvesting?
Yes.
I'm not sure if they're on hold right now. Every once in a while they get stopped by some permitting thing. And they would have to do that.
We had quite a few years now, haven't
Yeah.
Do you know what the current status is, David?
No, not really. I don't even know what clearing they've done out there, but I heard that they were gonna be starting to clear.
Yeah, they cleared all the way around the area.
The border, yeah.
There are some great websites out there. If you Google Red Lake Peatlands, and you can Google the Red Lake Band and Red Lake Peatlands together to see what they have written documentation about what their stand is. There are people that want to keep things as it is. Some people want to change, allow some change, and it's really a community decision and what they want to do with that.
They cleared off quite an area on the highland there, on the Sand Ridge, but that's for their center of operations for handling the material and stuff. But I don't know exactly how much work they've done down in the
Is that on the
bog
north
itself.
end? Is that the patch, the light patch up there?
That lighter green cloud,
Is that the area that's cleared there now?
It looks like that.
That road that keeps going straight, that goes to Baudette then.
Yeah, that's Farrell Truck Trail, right?
Yep.
So I know you'll be back for Big Bog Adventure Days,
Yeah.
this class, and other classes as well. So we'll see you then, and if you have any other questions, you can certainly ask.
I was just gonna add one thing about, one gal asked what peat was used for. When we had the oil spill in the Gulf, there was a company that was using peat to absorb that, and I don't know how it went, but.
Yeah, in the presentation that Berger did, well, this is way, when we started thinking about, the Big Bog and the interpretive center and the everything about development, they were showing us huge bales, like bales that were peat, were baled in bales that were really big and tall, and they actually used them in sewage ponds for filtering the sewage and cleaning the sewage. So I can see how that would be used. Yeah. It would be a good use for it.
Why is Red Lake red?
I think it's a high iron content, isn't it? What is it? Why is it red?
It takes on the color.
Tannic acid.
There was a battle.
There was a battle.
Do you know why they call it Battle River?
Battle. I lived on Battle River too. On the, I think it was the south.
There was a bunch of Indian blood in
Yeah.
there. Was it in between the Ojibwe? Yeah.
I think it's the chemistry of the lake.
It's the color of the water in the bog. That's the color of the water that comes out of the moss.
So it must do something for good fish, huh? Good walleye. Oh, and Penske, wow, what did you say?
Tannic acid.
Tannic, well, that's what comes out of the bog, yeah, right. Tannic acid is the acid I was talking about that is under, that plants cannot use because they can't tolerate it. But there must not be too much of it in there.
Those kind of plants that are there, they tolerate it to a certain extent. In fact, they're the ones that create the acid that's in it, is the moss that does it.
From the rotting of the moss.
Yeah, it's part of their chemical makeup, high acidic content.
I remember, Vince Buck. He was a forester that used to live up here. And he got out in the bog and he was so thirsty. So he saw water in the pitcher plants. So he just took one and drank it down and had to spit out all the bugs that were in it. Because pitcher plants that's what they live on, is bugs. And they digest the bugs. So, but he got a little drink anyway.
Did he get sick?
He didn't say he got sick. It was just another adventure. Anybody else?
Actually, the name Red Lake is a little bit of a misnomer because the Indian people, they actually called it Brown Lake. In the translation, it got tangled up a little bit in the English language. It turned out to be Red Lake. But in the English language, it would be called Brown Lake.
Yeah, when it gets all
Well, from
stirred
the
up,
color
it sure looks brown.
Yeah, from the color of the water that comes in from the bog, that's why it has that color to it.
Any other questions?
That one there is not a floating dredge. That one there is one that run on tracks. That's sitting on top of the ground.
Yeah, it's hard to see.
That's why the shacks weren't in the water too.
Yeah, the other one with the shacks behind it would have been
That's the ones that were the floating dredge. This one here is one that ran on the ground.
No further.
And there were both, because some of the peat was not that deep,
Yeah.
so they could do that. But like west of Hillman Lake, it was very,
Yeah.
very deep
And they always dug, with the floating dredges, they had to go downhill. They had to start at the upper end and go down, because it was the water following them up is what kept them floating.
Yeah.
If you got to a spot where the banks were too high, then you couldn't have deep enough water to float it. So that's why they went downhill with them all the time, with the floating ones.
Diane, if the dredges could only move such a short distance every day, and we had to cover such a large area, do you know how many of them were running at one point in time? Do you know at all?
I don't, but we have, the different kinds of dredges, but you also have Coochin County and Lake of the Woods, so I'm sure they were running in several places.
A lot of them.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there were different sorts right here, in several different kinds of dredges right here, so. I'm sure they ran hard, they covered a lot of ground, and
Yeah.
for the small amount of space they covered in a day.
One thing that's interesting too is that you had noted the year of 1929. That was the stock market crash, and then it was just shortly after that the Dust Bowl days came into being. And actually, this area up here, some of the farmers did quite well, because during those dry years, it was dry enough that farming actually did work pretty good. But the worst of it was then that peat soils would catch on fire. That was a downside of the Dust Bowl experiment or adventure up in this country.
And the big fire in the peat bog, when was that in the 20s sometime? 1930s?
30, 31 or 32 or
31,
something like that.
32, boy, it couldn't be worse timing, could it? You know, for all these poor folks that have just come through
Yeah.
the depression. And I remember when I was growing up, because we had little peat bogs all the way around, somehow my dad had cleared a field and he had put all of this into a brush pile and he'd burned the brush pile. And the peat underneath it burned all winter. You saw this just little stream of smoke all winter long. So once you get it started,
During
you know,
those dry years, my dad said that those fires that burned for 3 years before it got wet enough to put them out.
and I remember a story of a woman and her kids who laid in a ditch
Yeah.
when the smoke came over, so they could keep water, you know, keep their breathing airways open, because the smoke was so heavy from the peat fires.
This is kind of strange dirt in that it burns.
Yeah.
Soil.
Well, you can see why, because it's pretty vegetated.
All plant material.
Right.
In much of the world, it has been used as fuel for, in Ireland and much of the British Isles, peat is the
Russia.
fuel that they use for heating their houses.
Well, one thing to learn too, or to take note of, is that there's actually probably several different kinds of peat, but two main ones is you have this sphagnum peat, which is high in acid, but then you have marshland peat that was built up by grass, not by moss. It was formed from grass residue. That is a way more fertile peat because the pH factor is higher. It isn't acid because of because it isn't acid. It makes it a lot better soil.
And if you let a natural ecosystem take place, like if you have a small area, you notice some of these places from here, between here and Bemidji, that everything's starting to grow in around them. You know, any system like that eventually will grow. If it's sphagnum moss, it will continue growing on top of itself and actually make, you know, I mean, think about it, 10, 20 feet deep, just from growing on top of itself over and over.
That's an interesting thing to take note of when you do go to Bemidji. Just in my lifetime there's a couple of those lakes there along there have just about died. And they were all wide open. I can remember when I was a kid. Now the one of them, in fact, I saw lily pads across the whole thing here last summer or summer before. So that means that one there is done for too, as far as the lake.
It all keeps changing.
Yeah. It'll cover over eventually and the moss will take over. So lakes are dying every day.
Well, they're not
That's a
dying, they're just
natural
changing.
process.
It's
They're
a
changing,
natural
yeah.
process of the ecology, you know.
Yep.
Something else moves in and it's comfortable there and it keeps growing and it keeps changing. And,
Keeps changing.
yeah. And some of the changes we don't like very much,
Yeah.
you know. In all around the world, there are things that have happened that have not been good for their natural environment.
And then while we're going to move this out into the hallway, and you'll be able to pass through the table and kind of explore the peat. We have paper towels and so forth. Also, you can, you know, mill around, look at some of the displays that we have. This one here focuses a lot on peat and kind of, you know, the area. It'll tell you some of the same things that Diane told you if you read over that. There's also displays over there. And we have kind of fun little secret things in the drawers here you can check out. And then the display over there kind of focuses on wild rice, which is obviously our Minnesota state grain. So.
This was a presentation at the Big Bog State Recreation Area with Diane Mosted of Kellier, Ditching, the bog that couldn't be tamed.